All right, everyone. Welcome to this latest FFT webinar. My name is Justin Ellis, Executive Director of Fuel for Truth. I think many of you are familiar with FFT. I see a lot of repeat offenders here on the participant list. However, for those of you who are not familiar, we are a nonprofit organization that's committed to equipping individuals with the knowledge, the tools, and the confidence to having today's conversations about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We primarily do this through a multi-week boot camp is the name of our program for young professionals. That's our flagship program, in which we really kind of dive into the major history, from the modern Zionist era of the late 19th century through the present, how have we actually gotten to where we are today. We unpack a lot of conflict issues from the refugee issue, settlements, BDS, apartheid, things of that nature, as well. And I think it's most uniquely, and this is very important for our conversation today with Adar, is when you do have these conversations, when you are talking to someone whose understanding of reality is not the same as your own, how do you go about this in a very civil, persuasive, productive, and meaningful way when there can be times in which you feel like you're speaking in a totally different language than the person across from you. So that's also what we specialize in as well. So just to kind of hit the ground running, Adar Weinreb is the founder of Sulha, which is an amazing initiative that I'm going to give him plenty of time to talk about. But one of the reasons why I was so excited to do this conversation with him and to bring him into the fold here is that in many ways we do something very similar to what he does through Sulha, obviously in a different way, or certainly with a different audience, but primarily I would say the overlap that we have is really about how to have productive conversations, how to have constructive conflict in a time, in an era in which that seems to be all but outside of our reach, given certain social and political circumstances of this day and age. So Adar, to kind of actually here, even beforehand, if you guys have any questions, because obviously we don't want to be talking amongst ourselves the entire time, we certainly want to hear your thoughts. We want you to be part of this conversation. Please use the Q&A function. If you use the chat, that just becomes an endless thread of not always nonsense, but I'm not going to be able to keep track of it. So please use the Q&A. It's going to be a lot more organized that way. But here, to kind of get us started, Adar, before you even talk about Sulha, I think it'd be helpful for everybody to know more about you, because some people are familiar with your initiative, some people are not, but I can almost be certain that for those, whether they're on either end of that spectrum, they're not so familiar with you. And we're all products of our environment. We are all the sum of all our experiences. So whether it's business, whether it's technology, whether it's other initiatives, people tend to start the things they do because they find something's missing, something's lacking, or something's not being done to the extent that they would like. So what is kind of your genesis story and how did that lead to Sulha?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for hosting me, Justin. And, after you gave that intro, I realized how aligned our missions here are. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you and everyone listening. Thank you for coming. So as you could hear by my English, it's pretty good. I grew up in New Jersey. I'm an Israeli American. But on my Israeli side, it's it goes pretty far back. My family moved from Vilna, Lithuania to the hilltops of Hebron in 1812. Right. So I'm technically 10th generation Israeli, but I did live in New Jersey until I was 18 when I made Aliyah and joined the IDF. And growing up, I didn't know much about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I knew the Israeli narrative, right? I was taught about our deep connection to the land of Israel. I was taught about our exile, 2,000 years of exile and the persecution and Holocaust we faced while in exile, and our beautiful return against all odds to our indigenous homeland, but yet that we can't live there peacefully because the Palestinians won't allow us to live there peacefully. I wasn't taught to hate Palestinians, not by any means, but I was taught that we need to defend ourselves against them. If we don't, we'll be killed. And I don't believe I was raised on a lie, but I was only taught our narrative, right? One side of the story. And it took years until I even opened my mind to the possibility that there's another narrative. Interestingly, it was in the army where I had this realization. I was guarding on base, and when you're guarding, you're bored out of your mind generally, unless you're in like some kind of action zone, then you're really not bored. But I was bored out of my mind, and there's a poster on the wall showing different Hamas training techniques, and One of the posters showed a Hamas soldier crawling through sand. And it was interesting because so I looked at one of these Hamas soldiers and you could see his face. He just probably a few years older than me. And we were crawling through sand that same day. So I started looking at him and said, what's the difference between us? If I was born in Gaza, would that be me? Is the difference between him and I simply dependent on where we were born? Does his family view him as a hero and me as a terrorist? Is that possible? So these questions kind of like, I started asking these questions, and this didn't change my view overnight. But it planted a seed and really got me to understand that the biggest difference between us is dependent on where we're born. And if I was born in Gaza, I would view Israelis as the enemy. Now, even just this comparison I make between an IDF soldier and a Hamas fighter is offensive, but it's offensive to people on both sides. People get offended that I would dare compare a terrorist to a soldier defending his people. And then other people would be offended that I would dare compare a heroic freedom fighter with a colonizer and an occupier, right? So this just shows how vastly different the two narratives are. Understanding this, I realized, look, we need to find a way to bridge the narrative. Like, these narratives are contradictory, they're incompatible with one another. How can we begin to understand more about the other side? We probably won't agree on everything ever, but I don't think we need to agree on everything. I think we need to agree on enough where we could live side by side with one another. So it was really during the 2014 Gaza war where I was seeing two distinct narratives on social media: Gaza under attack or Israel under attack. Almost nobody was saying Israel and Gaza under attack. And that's when I decided that I'm going to start speaking up. And I really just started by writing Facebook posts. But that slowly, grew into other things. I saw people were responding primarily well to these posts. Obviously, when you're speaking on such a topic, you're going to trigger some people. But by and large, people seem to appreciate this balanced perspective. And I've been doing that for years, as well as helping different NGOs with marketing and promotion, which is something I have a bit of a background in. And then around 2 years ago, I decided to launch the YouTube channel Sulha. And the goal of Sulha is just to have conversations, right? You're going to hear about the Israel-Palestine conflict from Israelis, from Palestinians. You'll see everybody on Twitter fighting with one another. But where do you actually get them to see them speak? Have a respectful conversation. So that's really the goal of the channel. And the idea really is to learn more about one another. And I just want to highlight briefly the importance. So I don't think we'll never convince Palestinians to view Zionism the way we see it, right? And Palestinians will never convince us to view their nationalism or even acts of violence the way they see it or the way they feel it's justified. But if Palestinians were to learn more about our history, more about our connection to the land, it would be easier for them to forgive us for what we've done. And if we were to learn more about why Palestinians view us as colonizers and how our presence here has harmed them. Wait, hold on. I mixed that one up. If we learn more about them, it'll be easier for us to forgive them. And if they learn more about us, sorry, as you can see, I confused those two things. But essentially, the more we hear about, the more we learn about each other's narrative, the easier it is to forgive one another, because we understand that at the core, we're not evil, right? We have a deep history to this land. We were persecuted. We wanted a haven where we could be safe. Palestinians currently just see us as these evil Jews who want to take their land. But once they get to know us, they might not be okay with everything we've done in the past, but they could forgive what we've done. And if we understand that the reason why they view us as colonizers and how we've harmed them, and their violence has been a result of what they viewed as oppression and colonization for the past 100 plus years, it would be easier for us to forgive them. So forgiveness is an essential part of whatever solution we're going to find, whether it's one state, whether it's two states, whether it's a federation, confederation, or anything in between. Reconciliation is essential, and you cannot reconcile with the side who you don't know. whose narrative you don't understand. So my goal as an activist and the goal of the Sulha YouTube channel is simply to foster greater understanding and reconciliation between both Israelis and Palestinians.
First of all, thank you for that introduction. One, I certainly didn't even know that story, but I think it says a lot, certainly about the mind frame in which you're approaching this, and in many ways, it's definitely needed. In the class that I teach, I tell people on the first day, like, the idea that, let's be honest, we are born in a very particular time and we die in a very particular time. We only live in certain places. We only come into contact with certain people in our lifetimes. There's so much that happened not only before us, but certainly during our lifetimes, and what will obviously transpire once we've left this world. And I always remind people in the beginning, the idea that you're ever going to know anything about everything or everything about anything is an impossibility. And it does require us to have some humility to back up and say, you know what, I don't have a monopoly on what is true, what is real, what is important. There are obviously people who come from it from different points of view, who have different experiences, and that shapes their view of the world, and they're not so familiar with our perspectives also. But to kind of take it a step further in terms of what you start to describe, when you kind of had that watershed moment, seeing the Hamas poster, or certainly that as kind of like a catalyst for your interest, when it came to becoming more familiar with the Palestinian narrative, with hearing their stories, their lens and view of the world, what was that experience like, and where did you struggle in that journey?
So I would say one of the greatest struggles was needing to question my beliefs and relearn what I thought I knew. So the framing that we have of the conflict is very much, we're the good guy, they're the bad guy. But it's not as clear cut as that. We've both done pretty bad stuff to one another. And it's not hard to understand why the fear and hate exists on both sides. So needing to acknowledge that we are responsible for a large part of what's going on, and that we've caused the Palestinians immense harm, and at times unnecessary harm, I would say. That wasn't easy for me to accept because, again, I grew up thinking it's good versus bad, black and white. There's no question about it. I had to unlearn and relearn the conflict in a way more balanced and nuanced way. And it's interesting because our mind is very binary in how it works. So even today, I sometimes find myself getting caught up in the binaries of good and bad, and it's constant correction of how I view things, and understanding that binary just doesn't work with a conflict of such complexity. It's more complicated than just saying who the good guy and who the bad guy is here. And at the end of the day, I don't believe there's any bad guy. I think we're both good. We just do bad things when our back is against the wall, or when we're scared, or when we think it's in our best interest. So I think there's two sides who just want to live, ultimately just want to live in peace, but are acting in their perceived best interest, and our perceived best interest often contradict one another.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree as far as, just sort of the need to create the space for these, what may feel like irreconcilable narratives to exist, and certainly in a way that doesn't make you feel like you're questioning your own sanity or your own view of the world at the same time. Personal example for myself, I have a friend, American-born guy, is married to a Palestinian, lives in Jerusalem, and when he told me more about how Palestinians understand the Nakba, for instance, the aftermath of the consequences of 1948, the displacement of, what is approximately referenced as 750,000 Arabs of Palestine, once the war was over, no longer living in the same place in which they started. I had to eventually come to a point where it's like, were we responsible for this? Did we play a role in this? And more importantly, even if I say yes, even if I can acknowledge that, how do I create the space where that acknowledgement simultaneously occurs and certainly is not mitigated by, like you said, our refusal to ever say, you know, we're just going to commit suicide for the convenience of the world or for our enemies. Like, I'm never going to apologize for us defending ourselves and certainly standing up for my people, protecting my people. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, where you can acknowledge yes and yes, these are both true, or they can exist simultaneously in their fullness at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the Nakba is actually a big one, because in the pro-Israel space, the Nakba is seen as nothing more than just propaganda, or sometimes it's laughed at or even ridiculed. It's not taken seriously. But for Palestinians, the Nakba is a truly true tragedy, a traumatic event that displaced, as you said, 750,000 Palestinians. And it's very much a central part of their narrative. And for us to disregard it as if it's made up is not good for reconciliation, right? So we can acknowledge how hard it was for them, and even apologize that that was the result of the conflict. It doesn't change anything today, right? So people think by acknowledging that the Nakba was horrible, you're somehow conceding something essential. You're not conceding anything. You're just apologizing and acknowledging that they suffered, and it helps them move forward, right? We can't get caught in the past. Palestinians very much are stuck in the past. If you speak to them, it's very hard for Palestinians to move past the past and to move past their day-to-day living under Israel's military rule. Not hard to understand why, but when you try to talk to solutions with Palestinians, you'll see how often they go back to history and go back to the occupation. So to help create a dialogue where we're focused on the future, we need to acknowledge certain things about the past. And people seem to get triggered when I say we should apologize, as if we're entirely in the wrong. Because we did get attacked and we defended ourselves, but it's not as black and white as they attacked us, we defended ourselves. We very much, the displacement of the Palestinians started in the late 1800s, even, when we bought property off rich Ottomans, and we made the local inhabitants leave. And we very much justify that, oh, but it was legal. Again, we appeal to law. And if we see how the Ottomans got that land, it wasn't in the most legitimate way. So legal, but was it moral? Was it the right thing to do? Should we not still feel sad that Palestinians had to leave their homes? And also, a few 100,000 Palestinians were displaced before the five armies attacked us during the 48 war, right? So these are all things about like displacement that aren't quite, that we don't hear in the Israeli narrative, that we don't acknowledge. Israel also, the early Zionist leaders knew that we need a large demographic majority in order to have a Jewish state. So there were ideas and plans of population transfer decades before the Nakba. So, you know, it's not just we kicked them out because we had no choice. It was very convenient for us to slowly over time displace them. And then when war broke out, we really took advantage of that and never let them return, right? You know, their property was taken, their villages were destroyed. There was never ever compensation. They were never allowed to destroy it. And then most, like Hasbara, will say, you attacked us, that's the consequence. That complete lack of understanding and empathy of what Palestinians went through is, again, we're not winning allies. We're not convincing people. It makes us just seem like we're just like unempathetic and mean towards people who suffered because of a conflict we were in. Another narrative relating to the Nakba we commonly hear is, we didn't kick them out, they left. Some were actually forcefully removed. Others left because there was a war going on. But that's legitimate to leave during a war. Like, think about how many Ukrainians are leaving now. Imagine if Russia were to say, oh, well, we didn't kick you out, you just left. Well, yeah, you're going to leave. People leave their homes when they don't have a choice, and then to get their property taken, villages destroyed, and never allowed to return. There's something pretty nasty about that, and we should be able to acknowledge it. And I think we're going to need to an extent, acknowledge it if we want to be able to move forward. And this is a very difficult conversation for Jews and Israelis to have. But I want to just reaffirm that this doesn't say anything about our right for self-determination on this land, our right to exist, right? So we could acknowledge all that and still very much have a right to exist as a Jewish state.
To kind of take it back to some of the things you said, even in the classes I teach, when we talk about early Zionist history, when we talk about those organized land purchases that you mentioned from wealthy Ottomans, and obviously the tenant farmers were displaced. Like, yes, it was perfectly legal, but just like you said, to at least empathize or to see from a perspective that is not your own, like they had every right to be pissed off about that. Like for these people, they'd been living there for decades, sometimes generationally. And so even when this conflict begins, in a way, it does start from their point of view. It's like my country's being taken away from me. And you have these foreigners coming in. And obviously I'm trying to offer a perspective that is not my own. But to really just say that, these people, what's going on here? I feel like, these new people are arriving, they're creating kind of a separate society with very exclusivist institutions that are meant for Jews by Jews. And they're talking about a Jewish state, a new polity that's going to replace whatever's currently here, first Ottoman and then British. But at what point, like, where does this leave me? Where's the space for me in this idea of your redemption? What's going to be the consequence? But yeah, even when it comes to 1948, or certainly the aftermath of it, I know conversations are very different inside the land versus outside the land. And since I deal with mostly, an audience outside the land, I'll offer this perspective. We tend to hear a conversation. Let's put it this way. I think we tend to hear 1967 conversations or 1967 solutions for 1948 problems. And there's a reason why up to this point, they have not worked. It's not so simple just to offer that and nothing else, because obviously when you dive into the history, when you talk about Oslo, obviously everyone has their own point of view. However, I think that does speak to the fact that, the core sense of trauma that, you affirmed when it comes to the Nakba, when it comes to the aftermath that we've obviously now been dealing with 70 plus years, all the conversations up to this point that are meant to resolve the conflict don't actually address the core driver or the core grievance that is behind it all. And that's obviously very limiting when it comes to the reconciliation, certainly when it comes to the understanding and the ability to move forward that you were describing before.
Yep, I agree with you completely. And there's something in chat that I would like to read because I think it's relevant to this.
Mm-hmm.
So should we mention names of who posted? Is that the etiquette here?
First names, why not?
So this is from Jonathan. Jonathan goes, I still find anti-Zionism difficult to understand. Who actually takes a position that they want to eliminate an entire country, right? So that's, that's a good question, and many people have trouble understanding like that perspective. But I think it kind of plays into what you just mentioned, Justin, that for Palestinians, what it means to be anti-Zionist, and there's a difference between like anti-Zionism from Westerners and anti-Zionism from Palestinians. But Palestinians, the way they see it, as they were living on the land, and it's true there was no state of Palestine, but their nationalism did start to happen in the turn of the century, when many groups, that's when the concept of the nation state popularized, right? Many countries started becoming countries. So Palestinians had similar aspirations. And then all of a sudden, European looking fellas came, right? We are from the land, but we became Europeanized. The Ashkenazi Jews were very much Europeanized the past 2,000 years. So European looking fellas came with European garb. The language we spoke was European. We had different customs and mannerisms than the local populations, and said, this is ours. This is going to be a Jewish state. Why would they accept that, right? That would be like us accepting the Romans when they came here. We would never do that. So that idea of accepting a foreign, and this is why they hold that we're colonizers, because to them we came as a colonizing entity. So for anti-Zionism is just the refusal to accept an exclusive Jewish state on Palestinian land, right? So it's like, it's not necessarily destroy an entire country. It's more so not accept sovereignty on Palestinian land that is exclusive to Jews when Palestinians have been living on this land for many generations. Some Palestinians are even descendants of Jews from thousands of years ago. So, that's why anti-Zionism is so strong, and that's why Palestinians there's been such a refusal to accept any form of a Jewish state, because it's accepting that there's going to be some part of Palestinian land that is not for them. When
Or
it's framed that way,
legitimizes aspects of the status quo that they find intolerable.
right? Yeah. So I would say there's the status quo, which is our military presence in the West Bank, and then there's the status quo of Israel proper, and both of those have elements of it that most Palestinians have trouble accepting, even Palestinian citizens of Israel, many of which would like to remain Israeli citizens. But if you actually speak to them, a significant portion of them struggle with many aspects of the Jewish state, because it doesn't feel like it includes them. They're not part of the national story, right? The national story of Israel is about the Zionists returning. It doesn't include the 20% Palestinian/Arab population. Our national anthem is not about them, it's about us. Our institutions are about Jews. And there's a fair amount of casual racism, which mainly stems from fear that Palestinian citizens of Israel deal with. So, there's not only the status quo needs to change in Israel proper, and also in the West Bank and Gaza as well, right? There's different areas with completely different dynamics, but all of them need some kind of transformation.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even if you kind of dig into this further, you mentioned Hatikva obviously being representative of Zionist aspirations to return home, but obviously one of the first lines is looking east, right? How about the Jews that were east of Jerusalem at that point, whether it was in, Baghdad or certainly Tehran and elsewhere.
It's an Ashkenazi national anthem, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that's I think very interesting. I don't want to say the reciprocal because it's a little different, but when you look at or compare or contrast how Palestinians view Zionism, or certainly that word, you see a lot of certainly Jews, but even Israelis when it comes to who or what is a Palestinian and how that has changed over time. I think that tends to be its own misunderstood term. Obviously identity is fluid, terminology is fluid, it evolves. But this is something that historically was a geographic identity. It was not a particular narrow nationalism. It's one of the reasons why, when you hear Palestinians say Jesus was a Palestinian or King David was a Palestinian, a lot of times we think they're just trying to antagonize us and say, you have no connection here, you're not from here. But when it was just anyone who was living in this space throughout time is a Palestinian, if that's your working definition, then that totally makes sense. However, it obviously has evolved to one that became a more civic identity during the Ottoman period. And now it's a very particular nationalism that is more exclusive to Arabs, to majority Muslim and Christian Arabs. But that tends not to be the way that we understand it. I think we get confused in our own right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think today Palestinian is the Palestinian national identity, but certainly 100 years ago, it's been going through a constant transformation. And I think today it shouldn't be used as anything but the national identity of the Palestinian people to avoid confusion. I very much think we need to be clear in our language. So I object to the Jesus was Palestinian, because you're using the term Palestinian in two different ways. In one, you're saying Palestinian as the national identity. The other, you're saying anybody who ever lived on the land, which interestingly makes King David and Solomon, all these people Palestinian. I don't like that framing. I even had a debate on my YouTube channel with a Christian Palestinian about it on Christmas. It was a Christmas special. But yeah. I would say when it comes to Palestinian is something worth saying, and I don't know if any of the viewers here are think like this, but there's a rejection of the term Palestine and Palestinian, that it's made up, when we come to the importance of understanding identity being fluid, we need to accept that Palestinians exist regardless of if they had a different identity 100 years ago. Okay, well, now they're Palestinian and that's how they're identifying. And calling them something else isn't going to make them go away. If anything, it's going to strengthen their identity, because people's identity is strengthened when they're attacked for that identity. So like, let's accept Palestinians are Palestinian. And let's accept that Palestine exists. And what are the borders of Palestine? Unclear, but Israel and Palestine are coexisting on the same piece of land. It's possible even we might like, you could even have a solution where you have like a federation, which would be similar to the United States, having different states that gives people local autonomy, but still having some kind of like a central government. You might have two people living like across the street from one another. One says they live in Palestine, the other says they live in Israel. Like that's a potential reality that we might get to. So we need to keep our minds open, and we certainly need to understand that rejecting someone's identity isn't helpful to achieving
No,
whatever.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, unless your goal is to piss people off, and then fine. But if our goal is to actually make the situation better, that's not the way to do it.
Exactly. To kind of take it back a little toward Sulha, I'm curious to know, you've had a lot of interesting personalities on the program. I've listened to a lot of episodes. I'm familiar, and I know personally, especially the Jewish participants, whether it's Yehuda Cohen, Rudy Rachman, Yishai Fleischer, others that if you're familiar with sort of the Jewish or Israel activist ecospace, these names will be pretty familiar. But I'm also familiar with some of the Palestinians, whether that's, I'm going to blank on last names, so I'm just going to go with first ones, whether it's Antoine, Bassam. I think you've had Suleiman Khatib on, if I'm not mistaken.
No, not Suleiman, but I recently had Amr Zar on,
Mm-hmm.
who's a pretty controversial Palestinian fellow. Yep.
Yeah.
I could name some names if you want.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing. The biggest names we've had are Jewish. It's much harder to get Palestinians on the show because of anti-normalization. Like our Palestinians who come on the show, a lot of them then get backlash for engaging with Israelis. So I'd say the anti-normalization movement is one of the single greatest barriers to reconciliation, because there's a range of normalization, but some would say you don't normalize with the enemy, which means we shouldn't work with Israelis and just be their friends. Many would accept, okay, don't work for them and be their friend, but we can engage in dialogue because that's important. Like that's like a moderate view of anti-normalization. And then the extreme view would be like no contact whatsoever. And that I just can't really make much sense out of that. I don't see how you're going to get anything done if we can't speak. Yeah. But I think you're in the middle of a point, right? Kind of.
Yeah. So I was curious to know just, and granted, I think you started to partially answer what I was going to ask, just in terms of, which Palestinians are able and willing to participate. But also when it comes to just trying to pair individuals, how's that process looked like for you? Is it kind of just purely based on, personal relationships and, one has this view, one has that view? Do they know each other? Like, how do they, I guess for us, what arbitrarily feels like they happen to be on the screen at the same time, clearly something went into that to make that happen.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Booking and matchmaking is the single hardest part of the channel. It really is. I work full time. I recently started a new company called Grateful Giraffes. We're building a global gratitude community. I guess I'll give a quick plug if anybody wants.
Please do.
Find it. GratefulGiraffes.com. We're building a lifestyle brand and global community. It's also going to be an NFT collection, but we don't need to get more into that. But that does take most of my time. Booking and matchmaking is really, it takes identifying potential people, emailing them, finding a debate partner or conversation partner for them, and then setting it all up. There's a lot of like administrative work. I don't have much time for that, and it's just not playing into my strength. Like the whole administrative side of things that's not what I want to do in life, and it's not what I'm good at. I ideally would like to get to a situation where I could just have a booking manager and have somebody run the whole administrative side of the channel, and I could come and host and moderate the conversations. But also the channel is not about me. I'd like to see a future where there's many different hosts, Israelis and Palestinians, who are all contributing content, right? So I opened the channel and run the channel today, but the future, how I envision it, is that it's a channel for anybody who wants to come and be part of the reconciliation process, can either speak there, be part of a debate, host their own form of content. That's what we're working towards. Up until now, the way we do these bookings is I'll just, try to match two people up who I know. That's how we started it initially. I'd reach out to two people, ask if they want to debate, get them to agree, we'd do it. As we've grown, we now have people reaching out to us saying that they want to debate. So this clearly makes it easier, but we do have way more Jews that are waiting for matchups than we do Palestinians. So how can we solve this Palestinian bottleneck? I don't quite know, but I think the bigger we get, the easier it will become. If each episode is getting tens of thousands of views and we have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of subscribers, then I think we'll just have, enough requests that we can easily match people up with not much issue.
Mhm. When it comes to one of your goals being reconciliation and understanding that that is not a light switch, that's a process. When it comes to the Israelis and Palestinians, you match up. As far as you know, do they continue the conversation offline? Do they build any type of organic relationship? In spite of certain complications, what has been, I guess, the fruits of that labor on your end?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are people who stay in touch and continue to speak and then message me. I've gotten messages a few months later saying they want to do another episode together. And I get a fair amount of messages from people who say that they've just discovered the channel and that it's transformed their views. Like a Palestinian woman said she used to think Zionism was like Nazism, and now she understands that Zionists are just people. Okay, that's progress, right?
That's definitely progress.
Yeah, a 15-year-old Israeli boy living in Haifa reached out saying that he loves the channel and he had to rethink everything he thought he knew about the conflict. So these are the messages. And then I get some like nasty messages once in a while, but that's just part of the game, you could say. But yeah, these are real messages from real people who have been inspired. And what's cool about this model is anybody can do it, right? Like it doesn't need to be on YouTube. Anybody can find a friend on the other side. You can find people on all sorts of social media platforms and reach out to them and kind of have like a pen pal of sorts, pen pal of the modern age. And I used to, when I had more time, this is how I started. I would message a random Palestinian, or I'd see a Palestinian writing some anti-Israel stuff on Facebook, and I'd reach out to them and say, hey, I'm Israeli. I want to get to know you better. And then some don't answer, but others are like shocked that I would even want to get to know them. One said, why would you want to get to know me? Don't you hate me? I said, no, I don't hate you. I care about you and your people. Like, tell me more about yourself. I've made friends like this. This actually can change a lifetime of teaching, a lifetime of fear you have of the other side. People have the capacity to change if they just reach out to them. One person is not going to change enough minds to make any noticeable impact. But what's cool about this model is that it's easy to scale, right? If we create a culture of outreach, and people are enthusiastic about meeting those on the other side, anyone can do it. You need to be, I'll say anyone can do it, but there's sometimes a language barrier, and this is a challenge, right? If a Palestinian doesn't speak English and the Israeli doesn't speak Arabic, you know what I'm saying? So it's like you need a common language, so not everyone can speak to everyone, but there's millions of friends that could be made, cross-border friends that could be made, that if they were made, the face of the conflict would change. So that's kind of how I like to look at it.
When it comes to the Palestinians that you're able to get on the show or that you've built relationships with, I know every individual is unique, and it's not exactly like Group A always says yes, Group B always says no, Group C says maybe, but let's look into it. But I'm curious to know, are there any common threads that you see with these individuals, either based on where they live, where they're from, um, the types of experiences they've had with Israel or Israeli security apparatus throughout their lives? What would you say are sort of the common links between them?
I would say the common links. Are you asking specifically for Palestinians that I've spoken to?
You know what? Let's actually broaden it to Israelis also.
Okay, so the common links for the Palestinians is that the conflict is a central part of their lives, right? It's unavoidable. They're reminded of it on a daily basis. You could be a diaspora Palestinian and choose not to think about it, but they very much have a strong solidarity with their family members still living on the land. But West Bank Palestinians and Gaza Palestinians are reminded every single day of the conflict, and you could see it when you speak to them. It's hard for them to talk about anything else. And again, I say understandably so, because they live the conflict. On the Israeli side, that's not the case, right? We could go months, even years without being reminded. You know, if there's right now, it's quiet, no terror attacks, no war. I don't need to give any thought towards the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's a choice. So, I would say that's probably the main common thread at how focal it is in their lives compared to our lives. But aside from that, I'd say you still have pretty wide diversity of opinion across the board. Like there's Palestinians that very much want Israel to exist. They want two states. Then there's others that refuse any type, right? So you really do have a plurality in these groups. Yeah.
That's good to know. Here, we have a couple of questions here, and I think this kind of actually helps broaden the conversation we have. David's got a great question, which I think I failed to introduce in the beginning. What does Sulha actually even mean?
Well, so Sulha, which is Sulha in English, Sulha in Hebrew, and Sulha in Arabic, means to reconcile in Arabic. It's an Arabic word for reconciliation. More specifically, when two families fight and they finally make peace, they do an event called the Sulha, which they go to each other's homes and have a party with food and all sorts of good stuff. We use the term in Hebrew as well. Sometimes it's not like a common word, but you could sometimes use it in the same meaning that it's used in Arabic. It seemed like a very fitting name for the channel, but interestingly, some Palestinians are offended by the name because they're not ready for Sulha. You make Sulha once you make peace, right? For them, it's the ceremony after you make peace. And here it's like, we're not there yet. So I didn't realize that when I decided that name. So yeah, I don't quite know what to do. Most Palestinians haven't said anything, but I've gotten a fair bit of pushback on that name. Maybe one day we'll change it. I'm not going to force it. Only when I can think of like I want a better name to come, and I know when that name comes, I'll be sure of it, and I'll rebrand accordingly.
Yeah, brand recognition is important. You have to get to the point of Google before you change the alphabet, Facebook to Meta, if you want to even think about it that way.
Yeah. Like I don't feel like I'm in a rush. I see some of the biggest companies in the world rebrand once they're multi-billion-dollar companies. So it's like all good. I'll rebrand when the time is right. Yeah.
Yeah. God willing, the conflict will be over by then too.
Yeah, true. Yeah, true. Yeah.
Another question from Jonathan. And I think this kind of really goes back to the essence of our conversation, or certainly, why we want to sort of introduce you on, this program. Jonathan's asking, what's the best way to reconcile opposing viewpoints? Compromise, does it involve compromise or not necessarily? What in your view is involved in, what needs to be done or what you are doing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. A lot of arguments are about things that if we were to compromise or even concede, it wouldn't change the reality. So in many aspects, I think both sides, we just need to swallow our pride and acknowledge certain things. So again, acknowledging how horrible the Nakba is doesn't put Jews in danger, but it makes Palestinians feel better about their past, right? There's no harm, not only no harm, there's a lot to gain from that. Another interesting one, like I try to think of how we can frame the narrative in a unified way. So we say that this is a pretty new framing I've seen, but it's becoming more popular, saying Zionism is an indigenous rights movement. Right now, imagine Palestinians are like, indigenous rights movement, we're the indigenous people, you're colonizers. Okay, well, how about this? Zionism is an indigenous rights movement that use settler colonial methods to achieve their goals. Okay, that's a sentence that maybe both sides will be a little bit uneasy with, but it gives both sides enough that they're more likely to agree to it. Like Palestinians will be like, you know what? I could acknowledge that. You acknowledge that you use settler colonial methods. I'll agree that you come from this land. And Jews can say the same, okay, you're going to acknowledge that I'm indigenous to this land. I could acknowledge that we used methods that were akin to settler colonialism. Cool, right? So this framing, I think, again, we need to find these sentences for many different aspects of the narrative. But I think when it comes to things that don't actually have much of an impact in the real world, we should just swallow our pride and either apologize, acknowledge, and try to move to solutions. When it comes to solutions, whether you compromise or not really depends on what is being asked. But ultimately, I think both sides are going to need to make some compromise if this is ever going to work. We're not both going to get what we want. And I guess one more thing on the unified narrative, in order to like change culture, it's not enough to just have like ideas. Like intellectualism doesn't change culture as much as slogans do. It's interesting. Music, art, appeals to emotion are more likely to impact culture than like something very data oriented or something super intellectual, right? So we need to think of how we could, that's why I'm looking for these one-liners that have broad appeal that could shift culture. So from the river to the sea, all the people will be free. Interesting, right? Like it's an appropriation of a slogan that Israelis find very offensive. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. But let's make it about all the people. From the river to the sea, all the people will be free. That's actually what my Twitter bio says, right? So it's these little things that I think we need to think more on. I definitely don't have all the answers for how to build a unified narrative or how you reconcile certain differences between us, but I'm just one person. If we could put our collective energy towards this, we can certainly come up with a lot more ways to build a unified narrative.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to each of us kind of swallowing our pride, I think that is obviously easier said than done, especially when it's limited to sort of a worldview or lens. If someone's operating like in a paradigm that they're approaching this conflict in a very mutually exclusive way, that zero sum, that in order for me to win, you must lose, and in order for your victory or my victory necessitates your defeat. And if that's constantly the way we're approaching this situation, all of our actions, all of our behaviors, and certainly the psychology that backs it up will come from a point of I'm not willing to give you anything, because anything I give, that means you're taking and I'm losing. And I think that's really one of the biggest inhibitors behind all of this. If we are really able to change the psychology in which people on the land are actually living in, but also their cheerleaders in the diaspora as well. At that point, if you can really view and experience this in a very win-win way, one that is not mutually exclusive, one that no longer feels competitive, one that feels very collaborative, one that doesn't feel combative, it feels cooperative. And it obviously has to go beyond feeling. It has to be tangible. It has to be results oriented. But if you're approaching a solution in which we're both winning at the same time, then I can approach your victories as my victories rather than my defeat or my loss. And I'm going to actually be much more motivated to actually participate in gaining the things that you need, because it's getting me closer to the things that I need. And I know that's very difficult for people on the ground who, like you said, when you're living this conflict on a daily basis, when it's staring you in the face and you can't ignore it, especially Palestinians, but also Israelis who live in the West Bank, in certain parts of the West Bank more than others. That's, in my opinion, a big prerequisite that's needed for further advancement.
Yeah, I agree completely. Very well stated.
Thank you.
Justin, I'd like to invite you to come on the channel at some point. And honestly, this is our first time really chatting, you and I, but you could definitely also be a host. Like, you have what it takes to moderate these discussions. So you're hired, as they say.
I'm not blushing too much, right?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
The Zoom kind of takes away the colors, so don't worry.
Fair enough. No, but I mean, that's a wonderful compliment. I really appreciate that. Certainly would be happy to.
Cool. So we could continue that chat offline.
Absolutely. Here, for the remaining time we have, maybe some people will drop in a question here or there, but until then, we'd certainly love for you to plug more of the channel. If there are any kind of upcoming debates that you want to give a sneak preview to that people can hear about here first, any particular dates you want to put on the calendar?
So I've been so busy with my new project that it's been hard for me to plan things ahead, but we actually have a debate in 37 minutes. So
no time like the present.
Yeah, exactly. So it's between Tal. Tal has been on the program a lot. He's a liberal Zionist, and he's debating somebody who goes by the name of the old Jewish cowboy, who is an anti-Zionist, a Jewish anti-Zionist. There's more to gain from putting a liberal Zionist with an anti-Zionist than with putting like a right-wing Zionist and an anti-Zionist, because a right-wing Zionist and an anti-Zionist, there's such a far gap that it's nearly impossible to find any compromise. But here, because both people are seemingly on the left, it's a lot easier to bridge certain gaps. So this should be an interesting one. What else do we have coming up? Actually, next week I'm going to be having a guy named Rafi Gassel on the program. He built a federation solution, right, which we previously mentioned. So he's going to present the federation solution as he sees it, and I'm going to give him some pushback and ask questions. And we're going to learn about like this comprehensive solution to the conflict. Once in a while, I myself do a debate where I'm debating. So on Thursday, I'm actually going to be on somebody else's channel. His name is Adam Green. He's an anti-Semite. He's been on my channel once before.
Like self-avowed anti-Semite.
No, he's offended by that label. And I'm not one to throw around that term. I think we could dedicate a whole nother session to this, but I think by and large how many in the Jewish community are having the conversation on anti-Semitism, it's actually counterproductive. I think we're too quick to label people anti-Semites and attribute the worst of people when it might just be ignorance. So I don't use that word too liberally, but I can fairly say is anti-Semitic. He doesn't acknowledge it, but this is part of what we debate. So I don't think he has a link up yet, but I'll post it on my social media before doing it. So if anybody's interested, you can follow me on social media and I'll post it. Those are always sometimes hard to watch, but I enjoy in having those engagements with people. And then I guess one last thing that I'm trying to get this off the ground. I just need to find the time, but I recently got funding to do a project by some donor, and he says he would like to see in-depth interviews with 100 people living on the land where you really get to the bottom of what they believe. Like, what are their fears? What are their concerns? What are their aspirations? Polling doesn't get to the bottom of people's beliefs. Interview them and release it, and then build a solution based off the data you collect from these in-depth interviews. And in releasing them, you build traction around whatever solution, because people become invested in it by watching it week after week. So we already filmed a few, but I really am, and this is an appeal to anybody here. I'm looking to hire somebody full-time to take on this project. So if anybody has any interest, you could reach out to me as well, and we could talk about it. But that's something we're working on. Maybe one last thing. Most activists, both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, that you might follow on social media are not contributing to any form of progress when it comes to the conflict. Most
You'd say that inside and outside the land the same?
I guess people who the majority of their activism is social media. That's what I'm talking about. So both inside and outside the land. If you look at most of what these activists are saying, they're saying things that appeal to those who already agree with them, right? So people very much get caught up in the praise they get from their audiences, the comments, the likes, the shares or retweets, and people. So that's kind of how people measure their success, right? How many people agree with me? But that's not what we should be looking at. It's not how many people agree with you. It's how many minds are you changing? How are you bringing people closer together? This has much less appeal in the digital space because you get less praise. It's not as easy. But if you care, if your activism is about impact and not just notoriety, and again, if you want to be an activist for notoriety, fine. Everyone needs a life purpose and meaning. Like I'm not saying.
And also how it's monetized as a system.
Yeah, exactly. You're more likely to earn if you do it that way. So like, I get it, but like, I want all activists to ask themselves, what is the intention of what they're now posting? And does it have the ability to bring both sides together? Or is it just going to appeal to the people who already agree with you? And if you actually look at the majority of the content being created, whether tweets or videos by activists, it's not the kind of content that's going to change minds. It's the kind of content that's just going to appeal to those who agree. So I guess that's the thought I'd like to leave it on.
No, and that makes sense. I'll even tell you, I'm doing a lesson on settlements this evening with a group of young professionals. And one of the things, I don't think any of them are here, so I don't mind spoiling that in advance. But one of the things I mentioned, that big question, are Israeli communities in Yehuda and Shomron in the West Bank, are they legal or illegal? And fundamentally, that question or the answer depends on who you ask, right? It depends which source of authority you're appealing to. And most of the time, we appeal to the source of authority that's going to give us the answer we want. Just like, I think all of us can resonate, like growing up, like if we're kids and like we ask our mother something and she says no, our first instinct isn't like, well, shit, I guess I'm not getting what I want today. It's I'm going to go ask dad, see if I can get a better answer. And I think the same holds true with our politics. We want something to reaffirm what we're already kind of craving in the first place.
Yep. Cool. So that's going to be an interesting one. But yeah, I very much agree. That's generally how it's done. Yeah. Yep. You agree with the sources that reaffirm your position, and yep, 100%.
Or certainly you're much more gravitated toward it.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially confirmation bias, right? Like you're looking to confirm your position, not challenge your position. And I guess that's another thing I'd like to put out there. Question your beliefs. Try to disprove your beliefs. This should be like a good practice everybody puts themselves through. Ask yourself what you believe in firmly and go on an effort to disprove that. And maybe you'll learn something new and change your belief. And if you don't, you'll be more sure in what you believe and you'll be able to defend your position better because you're going to understand any counter argument because you've actually made an attempt to do so. Yeah.
No, it's beautiful and well said. Here, as we're kind of signing off, can you just obviously, I first want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. This, like you said, this was our first interaction and this was a great experience. And I certainly hope for many more in the future. When it comes to how people can follow you and the Sulha page, any particular pages or channels you want to plug before we sign off?
Maybe I'll just drop our link tree.
That's always a good way to do it.
Yeah, because I mean, there's like my personal profiles and stuff. There's like you could reach out to me. like if anybody has a question or wants to chat, like feel free to reach out. It might take me a few days sometimes to respond, but I'm very much, I try to answer everybody. Here, there's two link trees. One is for Sulha, the other one are my own. I just copied that from the YouTube video. Yeah, and that's it. And if you're interested, check out gratefuldgiraffes.com. It's going to be a global gratitude community. If anybody wants to come on the program for a discussion or debate, reach out to me. And thanks, Justin. This was fun.
My pleasure. And yeah, just for those who will be watching this on recording later on, those link tree pages are slash the Sulha, SULHA, and linktree slash Adar W. So that's how you can obviously get in touch and follow. Adar, thanks again. This was fantastic. Really appreciate the time and looking forward to chatting in the future.
Thank you, man. It's been a great pleasure.
Same. Have a good one.